Hi students, welcome to the third video in our series of videos that will explain to you how to write your war essay for this unit. Remember that the purpose of the essay is to argue whether or not your selected war was a necessary war. So far, we have completed 2 paragraphs for the essay. We've completed our introduction, which included the hook, background, and thesis, and then our first paragraph about the causes of the war, which included a topic sentence, 2 pieces of evidence, 2 elaborations, and a wrap-up. If you would like access to the paragraphs themselves to look at, you can find it on Moodle. If you go to our Moodle page and then go to the 2-3 folder where it says Begin Essay Outline, if you click on that folder, in that folder, you will find the click link for access to sample outline. If you click on there, it'll take you to the original outline template, which is where I have been writing these sample paragraphs. So let's start talking about how you need to write your third body paragraph, which is about the outcomes of the war. Similar to your first body paragraph, this paragraph will be historical in nature. However, instead of talking about what the causes were of the war, you will write about what the outcomes of the war were. And also similar to the previous paragraph, you will have a topic sentence, 2 pieces of evidence, 2 elaborations, and a wrap-up. So let's begin by writing our topic sentence for the second body paragraph. Let's take a look at this topic sentence. It reads, "The outcomes of World War I were devastating, including the obliteration of a generation and the condemnation of Germany that led to World War II." Now remember that in our wrap-up for our previous paragraph, which was on the causes, we ended with this statement, "This is why the war resulted in such destruction." This acts as a transition from the previous paragraph to this paragraph. Therefore, your topic sentence should carry the same kind of idea, concept, and tone as the previous sentence of your last paragraph. Just as this sentence talks about the concept of destruction in relation to World War II, or rather World War I, this topic sentence also mentions the devastation caused by World War I. We see that there is a link. These kind of links are what create what we call flow in a paragraph, where one paragraph flows to the next because it has these natural transitions that have what we call word recognition, where destruction and devastation are similar words that causes us to recognize that these concepts will be connected. So when writing your topic sentence, make sure that you're using word recognition and also utilizing the same type of tone so that your essay flows. Then also in your topic sentence, you want to make sure to indicate the 2 pieces of evidence that you will have in your paragraph, evidence 1 and evidence 2. From this topic sentence, you can see that the first piece of evidence will be about the obliteration of a generation. And the second piece of evidence will be about the condemnation of Germany that led to World War II. So the topic sentence indicates what the rest of the paragraph will be about. All right, so now let's move on to our first piece of evidence to see how that will work in our second body paragraph. So the evidence for this paragraph reads, "By November 1918, Germany surrendered to the Allied forces, and on June 28, 1919, the Treaty of Versailles was signed, officially ending World War I. However, this was not before 17 million soldiers and civilians died in what is often deemed as the slaughter of young lives." So when we take a look at this evidence, first off, this matches what we said would be the first topic of this paragraph, and we indicated that in our topic sentence. So the evidence provided here matches what our topic sentence said would be here, and that's important. Then what we do is we introduce the necessary information. What's different about this use of evidence is that it actually references 2 different sources in order to have all the information that it needs. So the first piece of information about the end of the war comes from the source World War I ended. And you can tell that this is the title of the work because it's in quotation marks. And that's because where I got this information from, the author was not listed. Then comes the second piece of information that discusses how many lives were lost during the war. And this came from a different source. If you pull your information from two different sources, make sure to note where each source comes from. And also note that none of this information is in quotations. That means that this information was all paraphrased into my own words. All of it except for one word, which is this word slaughter. The word slaughter specifically came from this source, and it was a word that the author chose to use within their description of World War I. Since I chose to pull out their word and use it in my writing, I need to indicate that this word came from something that was not my own. If you choose to pull out a word from another person's piece of writing, it's important to indicate that through quotes. Now, words that you don't need to quote, for instance, is the word civilians are 17 million. That's not uniquely worded. Those are the kind of words that you could come up with on your own. However, if you pull out very specific stylized words, you should indicate that you took them from the other source. All right, so now let's move on to elaboration and see what we do there. So let's take a look at our first piece of elaboration, which discusses what our first piece of evidence is about. So the elaboration reads, World War I is often considered the first natural disaster made by humans. Due to the out-of-date warfare tactics, leaders sent their soldiers to the front to be killed in the masses. This led to entire towns losing a generation of young men and countries being irrevocably altered. Even the soldiers who survived did not fully return, suffering from physically and mentally traumatic injuries. So here we have information that directly elaborates upon the evidence that we have, just as elaboration should. So World War I is often considered the first natural disaster made by humans, references what was shared in our evidence about how many people died in the war. Then it goes to explain why so many people died, and it was due to out-of-date warfare tactics. And then it goes on to explain that those out-of-date warfare tactics that led to 17 million deaths irrevocably altered entire countries who lost a lot of their young men. And then it goes on to explain that even the soldiers who survived didn't fully return because they suffered from mentally and physically traumatizing injuries. And we know this from reading All Quiet on the Western Front. So you can bring in some of the information that we learned from that into your own essay. So essentially the elaboration here explains why we should care about this information. So if your reader somewhat insensitively asked, so what, 17 million people died, why should I care? This was a century ago. This is why they should care. You explain that in your elaboration, showing the significance of the evidence that you provided. Now, let's move on to our next piece of evidence and see what we should put there. So let's take a look at our second piece of evidence. It reads, due to the death and destruction of the war, the victors demanded reparations from the surrendered Germany, ordering $63 billion in separate payments over time. When Germany had to pay its first $500 million, they began printing money for everything. They printed so much money, knowingly devaluing their currency. This destroyed Germany's economy. And that was written by Suda. So here we have our next piece of information. This transition, due to the death and destruction of the war, transitions from what was previously stated in the elaboration. So in our last piece of evidence and elaboration, it talks about the destruction primarily with the death toll. So by saying due to the death and destruction of the war, this transitions from what we were previously talking about, the death and destruction of the war, and then leads into the victors demanded reparations from the surrendered Germany. That's how transitioning works. You reference what you just wrote about, and then you explain how it relates to what you're going to write about. So this part of the evidence is a transition from the last piece of evidence in elaboration. Then it goes into its new facts, where it discusses how much money was demanded from Germany, and and what happened when they had to pay all of that money. Note that part of my evidence is paraphrased here, where I put in my own words how much money was demanded from Germany and also how much their first installment was, but then I quote this specific line: began printing money for everything, they printed so much money, knowingly devaluing their currency. The reason why I quoted this and nothing else is because I particularly liked how the author worded this part of their article, and I wanted to bring in that wording to convey the damage that was done to Germany when they had to pay for the reparations. Then I make a clear statement about the outcome of this evidence, and that was it destroyed Germany's economy. And note that all this information came from an article written by the author Claire Sudath. Since there is an author here, I put her last name in the in-text citation. For all of our previous pieces of evidence, it has been titles because there are no authors provided. Since an author is provided for this article, I put the author's last name there. So now let's move on to our next piece of elaboration and see what we do there. So let's take a look at our elaboration. It reads, war reparations make ethical and logical sense, where there must be some form of punishment for countries who initiate or worsen wars, because this not only helps the attacked countries recover, but also dissuades countries from acting aggressively in the future. However, the harshness of reparations demanded of Germany, essentially plummeting German civilians into poverty, created a void of hopelessness and desperation that allowed Hitler's rise to power and the occurrence of World War I. So this elaboration does a great deal of things. Largely, it asserts an opinion, which remember is really what your elaboration should be doing. It should be you sharing your opinion about the evidence that you just provided. So here you can see that this is a clear opinion. War reparations make ethical and logical sense. That is not research fact. That is the opinion of the author about what has been shared in the evidence. And then the author goes to explain why they believe war reparations make ethical and logical sense. They say where there must be some form of punishment for countries who initiated or worsened wars, because this not only helps the attacked countries recover, but also dissuades countries from acting aggressively in the future. So, the statement made here is proven by the explanation after. A lot of writers will stop right here. War reparations make ethical and logical sense. And then they'll move on. But that's not enough. Just making a statement is not going to convince your readers. If you make a statement of opinion, you need to explain why your opinion is true. Otherwise, no one's going to believe you. So make sure to thoroughly elaborate upon your ideas. When a teacher asks you to do that, that's what they mean. They want you to take this straightforward statement and follow with an explanation as to why we should believe that statement you have made. Then the elaboration goes on further. It says, however, the harshness of reparations demanded of Germany created a void of hopelessness and desperation that allowed Hitler's rise to power and the occurrence of World War I. Here, that part of the elaboration fulfills what our topic sentence promised it would talk about. It explains how World War I essentially resulted in World War II. Next, let's move on to our wrap-up to see how we're going to end this paragraph. Our wrap-up reads, therefore, again, remember to have your transition at the beginning of a wrap-up. You have some kind of transition that indicates that this is the last section of the paragraph. Therefore, the outcomes of World War I were not only horrifically tragic for the countries involved at the time, but also for the following generations. The catastrophic effects of World War I rippled onward, causing poverty, suffering, and further warfare decades into the future. So, here, we address our two pieces of evidence. And we do it not directly, but it is implied. So it says the outcomes of World War I were horrifically tragic for the countries at the time. This references our first piece of evidence. Then it says, but also for the following generations, which references our second piece of evidence. Then it makes a concluding statement about how terrible all of this is. And this will nicely transition to when we talk about our opposition and then our own position.